Howdy, folks. Humanities 2, Shasta College. We're going to do film until we drop. I'm going to go over the 1940s real quick and the 1950s, which brings us up to 1960s and the documentary I want you to watch for your quiz. The quiz, I'm going to post it tonight. It'll be due on Monday. You have all that time to do the quiz. But you need to watch the documentary that I've posted in modules called Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. If you don't watch that, you will not do well on the quiz. And you could Google that movie and you could Wikipedia that movie, and it's still not going to give you the answers you need. You need to watch it. And that's what I want you to do is watch it and try to learn to enjoy it. It is a film class right now. And so watching a film could be fun for you, supposedly. Anyway, please watch that movie, and then there'll be three essay questions. Um, when I post it, I'm going to tell you what I don't want you to say. Don't be, take your time in answering the questions. Respond fully. Explain yourself. They're essay questions. They're not true or false or multiple choice. I'm going to give you a hint, huge, big hints right now, how to succeed in this test. 3 parts. So number them that way: part 1, part 2, part 3. I'm going to ask you about how the culture influences artists. What do I mean by that? You should know by now. We've been talking about it all the way along in all the topics. What's going on in the environment, the culture, the society, politics, wars, peace, famine, drugs, whatever. What's going on that's creating this art? Because art doesn't create itself in a vacuum. There's a reason for it. That's why we're doing superhero movies right now. There's a reason for it, folks. I'll talk about it next week. Um, it's not an accident that we're in a comic book world now in Hollywood, okay? So here's the thing: 3 parts of the test. I will post it tonight. Then you have to come up with a reasonable response. It's worth 15 points. You have until Monday to take it. Now, I'm going to give you example of an answer right now, but you can't use this answer. But this is an example of what I'm looking for. In the movie, you're going to be hearing a lot about the new directors that started the movement. Guys like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steve Spielberg, George Lucas. That was a new breed of film school directors. First time in our history that we ever had that. And they changed everything there was to change because they were going to make movies that the young people could relate to. And so they're going to tell stories that young people will relate to. They're not telling stories for another generation. They're telling the stories for their generation, which at the time was my generation. Okay. I was perfect for this, and it swept over me and made me want to become a filmmaker. These films that are in that movie, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. It's called that because it starts with the movie Easy Rider. Maybe you've heard of it. Famous biker movie with Peter Fonda, Dustin Hoffman, and it ends with Martin Scorsese's last brilliant film called Raging Bull, with Robert De Niro as the boxer Jake LaMotta. Brilliant. A film I actually got to work on in L.A. when I lived down there. Anyway, it ends with that. That's the title. That's what it means. But you got to stick to the end to understand what the title even means. Pay attention to the documentary. You'll do just fine. But when I ask you, how did the culture influence these young directors? You got to look at what's going on in the culture at the time. Historically, what was going on? There's a bunch of stuff going on. You'll see it in the documentary. I don't want to give it all away right now, but I will give one answer away, and now you can't use it. The civil rights movement. All right, enough said. That's all I'm going to say. If you listen to this lecture, you'll know the kind of thing I'm looking for. And then when you say civil rights movement, explain what you mean. Give us some context. How would that influence anybody? Why would anybody pay attention to that? And how does that affect their storytelling? Well, it does, folks, because we're all affected by the society and culture we're living in at the moment. Right now, we're making films about the pandemic. We're making films about politics in Washington. We're making films about the war in Ukraine. We're making films about everything that's going on right now in the culture, the gay community, the trans community. That's what's happening in the culture right now. That's what we're making films about. And so that's what's going on, and that's why the films are reflecting that, because our movies, like all great art, reflect the culture. So think about that answer I just gave you. But here's the answer I don't want you to do. Don't do the cliche thing and say sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If you say that, you won't get any points. Listen to me now. Do not say sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because it was so much more than that. So much more than that. And that is not the answer I'm looking for. Yes, there was sex going on. Sex has been going on since the caveman, folks. It's been going on for Hollywood for 100 years. It's nothing new. Um, Rock and roll is definitely new. Drugs has been going on forever, folks. They've been smoking reefer for 150 years, or booze. Yes, there was a lot of drugs going around in the 70s. Half these filmmakers never touched them. Some of them did, but I don't want you to use that as an answer, because that's not the answer I'm going for. It's too easy. So there'll be 3 questions. Each of them require an explanation, a small essay, 2 or 3 sentences, each worth 5 points, 15 points total. I'll post it after I shut up here and post my lecture. In the meantime, that's the quiz. There's extra points. I said assign a film. If you want to do an extra assignment to do 10 extra points, watch the movie Midnight Cowboy. Came out in 1969, groundbreaking John Schlesinger movie. Write a paper about that. Get it into me now, and you'll get 10 extra points just for doing the paper, if you need the points, and some of you do. The other thing, the do is the journal. Get them in right now. Some people are already handing them in. I've printed the samples of the journals. You should know what it looks like. You should know what it walks like and talks like. So get that in. It's an easy 10 points. If you weren't paying attention, then you won't do good on it. Don't try to fake your way through it. I could tell when people are doing that, when they didn't pay attention, they didn't take notes, because it won't be detailed enough. I need a little bit of explanation about every week we've done. You can hand it in right now till next week. This is the last week of school, folks. We get out in 1 week. So we're at the end game. And today I've given you a fast track history of cinema. We started in the early days. We're still in the early days. 1900s, 1920s, 1930s I covered. Now I got to cover 1940. What started in 1940? Think. Put your thinking cap on. What would influence the films of the 1940s? If we're in class, I'd ask for a hand raise. A little thing called World War II. 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and we declared war on Japan and Germany at the same time. We were at war, folks, and this affected the Hollywood filmmaking machine. They became a machine of propaganda films. Propaganda films, World War II films that were made, a lot of them starred John Wayne, Van Johnson, a bunch of actors who did not go in the war to fight, for whatever reason, they were too old or they had some physical infirmity. You could stay home in those days if you had children. They didn't send you to war if you had a family already because they figured you're the breadwinner. They don't want you to get killed. So, but a lot of actors did. I'm going to show you, there's a little documentary I'm going to post. It's called uh, Hollywood Goes to War. You'd be surprised how many Hollywood famous movie stars and directors actually quit their jobs in Hollywood to go join the army as pilots, as ground soldiers, and yes, some of them were killed. A lot of, but most of them came back. The stories to tell. Um, there's a great documentary. I'll show the previews to it. It's called Five Who Came Back. Five Hollywood directors, big ones, who'd won, most of them had won Academy Awards already. John Ford, Frank Capra, John Huston, William Wyler, George Stevens. They were already rich, fat cat, famous directors, and they quit their jobs to be directors in Hollywood, and they joined the war. Now they were too old to fight because most of them were in their 50s, even older, 60s, and so they filmed the war. Their camera, all the footage we have of World War II, these people filmed the war, documentary filming. They filmed the invasion of D-Day. They lost 20 cameramen that day to bombshells and machine gun fire. They died taking film of the invasion. John Ford, the famous director who directed all those movies I talked about last week, Stagecoach, et cetera, filmed the Battle of Midway with his camera crew, and he was wounded. Kamikaze pilot hit his airplane, and he was hit by shrapnel. I think he was 62 years old or something, and he got a Purple Heart. I think he got 2 or 3 Purple Hearts. These guys put their lives on the line to film the war. George Stevens was one of the first guys to film a concentration camp. His camera crew filmed a death camp. We'd never seen that before. These guys are right in the thick of it. And they gave up very profitable careers in Hollywood to do fight for the country. What Hollywood star would do that now? Think about it. There was a documentary called The Pat Tillman Story. Maybe you heard of it. Pat Tillman was a star football player who was just getting his career going. They just signed a $3 million deal when the Gulf War. This is I do believe the second time we went to the Gulf War. This would be in the early 2000s when George Bush Jr. was in, and he walked away from that career. Because he felt like it was his calling to serve his country after 9/11, and so he went to fight in Iraq, Afghanistan, and he was killed in the line of action. He was, I think, 26 years old. Well, the Bush administration, there's a great documentary called The Pat Tillman Story. The Bush administration said he died a hero. He died in combat, all true, but he didn't die a hero, folks. That was a made up story. He was killed by his own guys accidentally. That happens in warfare. He was out front. He was hit by gunfire from behind, which was our guys shooting that way. And so he was killed by his own guys. But the Bush administration needed propaganda to prop up their sabers and get the profit machine going to get more money to go to the war against Saddam Hussein. And so they said he died a hero to use it as propaganda. Even his parents believed that until they found out the truth. The parents were even at the White House for a ceremony. It's in the documentary. When the parents find out how their son really died, they came out and they were outraged that the Bush administration used them and their death of their son to profit the war, meaning get the coffers, the funding for the war. Propaganda is really strong. World War II, we put out a lot of propaganda films. Every war film was essentially a propaganda film. And what that means is they were selling war bonds in the movie theater. And so you'd go see John Wayne and the Sands of Iwo Jima, which he gets killed, by the way. And it's a decent movie, not taking you with, and but it's a patriotic movie. How we need money to fight the war, and people would pay at the box office for war bonds. You could buy a war bond for $20 more, and movie stars went out and collected war bonds. There was drives for these war bonds because we had to come up with millions and millions of dollars to build ammunition, tanks, ships, bullets, and people like John Wayne, who made a bunch of movies like that, who didn't go actually fight in the war, but he did a great service to his country because his movies made the war effort look like we were doing a good job. We're the good guys. And so they got the funding to do the war. Also, during the war, women had to do men's jobs because men had to join the military, and the draft was huge. And so all the big jobs to build tanks and ships went to women. There was they called her Rosie the Riveter. Maybe you've seen the posters for that. She was taking care of business because there was no men to build these things. They were going to go fight the war. So women went to work. They put down their dish rags and they took the baby over to their mothers and said, "I'm going to help the war effort by building battleships, tanks, everything else. Without the women building the stuff, we'd have no workforce." So these movies were most of the 1940s were taken up with this type of movie. Yes, there was other movies, but always usually the propaganda machine was strong and always made America look great, even though we weren't so great sometimes. We lost a lot of battles, especially early on, but they didn't want to show that. And so America goes to war, and we're all sort of believed in the same concept. Hitler was bad, Japan was bad, so it was a good cause. Um, Everybody put sacrificed in this country. My parents' generation, my dad went to war, but my mother stayed home, and they had rationing, food rationing, sugar, milk, eggs. That was all rationed. Gasoline for the cars, rubber for the tires, because everything went towards the war effort. That's how important the war effort was. And it's probably not probably, it's the last war we're all together on the same page. Now that since Vietnam, we're not on the same page at all. On the society is always not on the same page as the government often. But World War II was different, and the movies reflected that. And some great directors directed some great movies in that era. And other countries were being bombed, like England, and so the movies coming out of there weren't as many, but they still were coming out of there too. And so that was the theme of World War 1940s filmmaking. Now, when these directors came home, it was a different story. Their post-war films are some of the bleakest, most realistic, naturalistic films ever made in Hollywood. Um, they couldn't make the same entertaining movies that they made before. They couldn't do a propaganda film. John Ford came back, and his first movie was called "They Were Expendable," a true tale about early goings on in the war, where we were losing to Japan, Wake Island, etc. And he told the producers, he goes, "I won't do a propaganda film. I'm going to show what really happened, and either do that, or I'm not going working for you guys." And so the movie ends. Yes, it ends on a patriotic note, meaning they play the battle hymn of the Republic and over the credits, but we were losing at the end of that movie. But we know the war turned out. So we know when we're watching that movie, which came out in 1946, right after the war, We know how the war is going to turn out. But it didn't look so good for America early on. We were ill equipped and not ready to go to war. All these filmmakers made realistic, bleak films. Frank Capra's first movie was It's a Wonderful Life. Maybe you watch it every Christmas. Well, it's about a guy trying to commit suicide who didn't feel he was part of his community. And a little angel comes down to save him and say, Your life has meaning. And James Stewart, who went to war, he was a colonel, an Air Force colonel, the actor. That was his first movie he did when he came home, and he thought his career was over. He goes, Nobody's going to want to watch this film about a guy who wants to commit suicide. Well, when that movie film came out, it was not well received. But now it's a perennial favorite during Christmas. It takes place during Christmas, and everybody watches it during Christmas. It's a heartwarming story about survival and how all of our lives matter. But when it first came out, he thought his career was over. Um, George Stevens made Diary of Anne Frank, grim story about the true life tale of the Jewish girl hiding from the Nazis in Amsterdam in an attic, based on her famous diaries. That's the movie he made. William Wilder made possibly his greatest film called The Best Years of Our Lives about returning veterans. And it was done realistically. It was not a hey, great to have you back. They didn't know how to fit into society. And he told a really realistic story, led by Frederick March, about returning veterans. No one had ever seen the likes of it before. These directors had been changed. They can't go back to the old ways because they'd seen too much. George Stevens saw the concentration camps, and he made kind of happy musicals, a bunch of musicals with Shirley Temple, big star in the 30s. He can't go back to that. He said, I can't do those anymore. I've seen too much. And if you want me to do those movies, hire somebody else. So these filmmakers are changed. The films are changed. They were reflecting what the culture was going through. Okay. The 1950s, we're now in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The threat of atomic warfare is real. And the filmmakers made films that reflected that. Guys like Elie Kazan, who directed some of the greatest films of the 50s, like On the Waterfront, Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, and um, Billy Wilder, who made Solid 17, The Apartment, Sabrina. These were hard hitting, cynical films. They weren't all entertainment. We had this thing called film noir in the 50s. Noir, black film, it stands for, it's a French term. And these films, they made 50, 60 of these films, low budget films about criminals and detectives working at night with low budgets, low lighting. Film noir is one of our greatest genres we've ever had. And it reflected the returning veterans, what they were going through. They couldn't go back to their regular lives. They were directionless. They didn't know what to do. A lot of them turned to crime. It showed the underbelly of our culture. Some of the best films ever made were made in this era, all influenced by Italian neorealism, which I can't go into too much without overloading you guys with too much information. When Italy came out of the war, they wanted to make films. They didn't have any money, and they didn't have any movie stars. They don't have any budgets. They don't have fancy costumes or lighting. And so they made these realistic films on the streets of war-torn Italy. The two most famous ones are Bicycle Thieves and Rome Open City. When they were filming Rome Open City, the Nazis were still occupying Rome. Hitler was dead by then, and they were definitely on the run, but they were still there. And they filmed it in secret. Bicycle Thieves is a story, universal story about war-torn Italy. There's no jobs. There's no people are starving to death. And this guy who has a son he's trying to support and a wife, he's desperate to find work, but he needs a bicycle. Simple as that. He gets a bicycle and he gets the job. While he's at his job, his bicycle gets stolen. He spends the next hour and a half trying to find his stolen bicycle. You think that's a simple story? It's as complicated as anything there is because he changes as a human. He wants to put food on the table, but he needs that bicycle. That's how important it was. And so, what does he do at the very end? He steals the bike, another bike, but he's caught. And his young son, who's 8 or 9, actually sees him getting caught, and he pays the ethical crime of trying to put food on the table. He's not a bad guy. He's just a father trying to survive post World War II. Besides the humiliation, they don't charge him with a crime, they let him go. But his son saw what his dad did. And so he's going to have to do some explaining on that sad story. And it's all filmed on the streets with real lighting, no movie stars. They're all amateur actors. Victoria De Sica changed cinema with that movie, and American filmmakers saw that. And it reflected what was going on in Hollywood, although we were never occupied by the Nazis. Filmmakers made more realistic, real films, naturalistic films, what people are really going through instead of fantasy entertainment, which a lot of Hollywood was, like it is right now. It's all fantasy and entertainment. It's not, sorry guys, there's nothing to be real about Iron Man. Nothing. There is no Iron Man. There's no Thor. Sorry guys, it's comic book. I'll talk about it next week when I close it off in films. But why this obsession with these comic book heroes? There's a reason. Think about it. The culture. I gotta think now. I'm really going through this fast. Sorry, guys. It usually takes 17 weeks to teach this course. I'm doing it to you guys in 2 weeks. Sorry about the rush, but that documentary I want you to watch. We'll cover the 60s pretty good, into the 70s, and we'll finish it off next week by going into the present time in films. Do well on that test. You know what I'm looking for. If you heard this lecture, you'll know, but I'm going to put the hints in the assignment also. Good luck. Try to enjoy the weekend. This is the last week of school. I know everybody's stressed. I know. I get it. I am too. If you notice, I've been trying to grade your papers like crazy. I only got one more essay to grade. And yes, I do read them all. Okay, students, watch some films, will you? Especially watch that documentary you need to watch and do well on the test, and you'll do okay. Enjoy your weekend as much as you can. Take a walk your dog, tell someone you love them, tell someone you deserve to be loved, and the world will be a better place. See you next week.